So according to the Recovery Village, there are approximately 2.5 million people who die in the United States every year, and they leave behind an average of 5 grieving people. That's 12.5 million newly grieving people every year in the United States. So chances are pretty good that either you or someone you know is grieving a loss right now. Grief is really hard for us to talk about, and I think it's because it makes us feel so powerless. We have absolutely no control over life and death, and yet we do have control over how we approach life and how we understand death. I've been living with grief for over 25 years, and I knew that if I was ever going to be able to feel real joy again, I was going to have to learn a new way to understand life. My daughter Nikki was diagnosed when she was 16 months old with cancer. I was pregnant with my second child, Michael, at the time, and my third child, Matthew, was born just after she finished treatments 2 years later. When a child's diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, there's a different kind of grieving that occurs. My husband and I grieved the loss of our healthy child. We grieved the loss of certainty. We didn't know if she was going to grow up. And we learned a very new appreciation for how fragile life really is. She did survive. And after she finished her treatments, we moved on and life became relatively normal. But as most of us know, normal is an illusion and life is unpredictable. Just 3 years later, my husband Kerry was diagnosed with cancer. He was 34 years old. I was convinced that he was going to live. After all, Nikki survived. He was convinced that he was going to die. And he told me it was because when Nikki was sick, he had prayed that God would take the cancer from her and give it to him. And he felt like his prayer had been answered. He wanted to save his daughter. He found meaning and purpose in his suffering. But then, because life is rarely what we think, a year into his treatments, Nikki was diagnosed with a secondary cancer, and she was going to need a bone marrow transplant to survive. The meaning and purpose that he thought he had found was lost. But he did learn that you can't trade one life for another. That's just not the way it works. Kerry died in April of 1994. And at the time, Nikki was out of treatment options. After relapsing after her bone marrow transplant, we knew that there were no other options. And so with the shadow of her father's death, we knew that her days were numbered and we had to live. Nikki taught us to embrace life. And so we went to Northern California and we hiked the redwoods and we joked that it was with her on my shoulders most of the time. We went to San Francisco and had Chinese food in Chinatown. We went to Ohio and visited relatives. She got to go swimming with her brothers, something she hadn't been able to do because of her treatments. And then just 4 months after her dad, Nikki died. Again, I wish that life would have just stopped, but it doesn't. It kept moving forward and we needed to as well. So on New Year's Eve of 1994, we moved to Spokane, Washington. It was against the conventional advice of making any major changes so soon after a loss, but it was the right decision for us. We were going to start our new lives in our new home in the new year. And then we began the long process of healing. Grief counseling, lots of tears, and there were times when I felt hopeless. I started to search to try and understand, why does suffering exist at all? And I discovered Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he said that even in hopeless situations, we can turn a personal tragedy into a triumph. And knowing the horrors that he had been through, something shifted in me. I remember the first Mother's Day after Kerry and Nikki passed, and I just wanted to pull the covers over my head, and my boys came running into my room, laughing and shouting, "Happy Mother's Day!" And I remember it was the first time that I felt joy and sorrow simultaneously. I discovered that when I went to the depths of grief, I also had an equal and expanded capacity for joy. But life was going to show me once again that it had its own plans. And those words of Viktor Frankl were going to be tested again. Because 3 years after moving to Spokane, Michael was diagnosed with a brain tumor. I could not believe it was happening again. He was 10 years old. I told myself that he was going to survive, but that isn't what happened. He died 2 years later at the age of 12, and I truly believe that Carrie and Nikki welcomed him home. Matthew and I needed to once again move forward. When Michael died, the depth of my grief felt bottomless. It was like nothing I had already experienced. It felt like fire was burning through me. Nature has a lot that it can teach us about life. There's a symbiotic relationship between fire and the giant sequoia trees of Northern California. Every 10 to 20 years, fires sweep through the forest and it clears the brush on the ground. The thick bark of the trees protect it from burning, but the heat rises to the top and the cones expand and drop seeds to the newly cleared ground. It's because of the destructive force of fire that new life occurs. So I began to imagine that perhaps the grief that was burning through my life could open me up to new ways of understanding. I had a choice to make. What was I going to do with this powerful force of grief? I could spend the rest of my life angry, in sorrow, in despair, or I could choose to allow myself to learn a new way to understand life and death. But there are no shortcuts. Grief isn't something that we just get over. There's no going back to the way life used to be. When someone we love dies, our lives are changed forever. Grief is a solitary journey, and we have to find our own way through it. But the paradox is, we can't do it alone. I had the support of friends and family, but I also found a community of other bereaved parents. I talked with others who have lost their spouse. Being with people who understood the depth of my sorrow helped me realize that I wasn't alone. I wasn't being singled out for this affliction. Grief counseling, one-to-one, helped me navigate the emotional roller coaster that I was on. I also found that I needed to expand my understanding of spirituality. The religion of my youth, although it does hold nuggets of truth, just was not big enough to hold my new experiences. I needed to learn a new expanded way to understand God and what it means to be a human being. I learned to embrace life the way it is, and not the way I was taught that it's supposed to be. We are told over and over that children should not die before their parents, that it's against the natural order, that young mothers and fathers should not die before they get to see their children grow up. And it made me feel like there was something wrong with my life. And yet, these things happen much more than we care to admit. There is nothing wrong with my life just because it didn't turn out the way I planned. Who says that this is the natural order? Life is a mystery, and we all can find our own way through it. I don't know why my husband died at 36, or my daughter at 9, and my son at 12. But I truly believe, I have to believe, that Carrie, Nikki, and Michael lived their lives fully because that is how many years they were here. And love doesn't die. Our relationships continue in new and different ways. Grief is not a permanent and static state. It will ebb and flow throughout our lives as long as we live. We can consciously learn to live in a symbiotic relationship with grief because we're all going to experience it. And really, if we can just remember, in the end, we are all going to be just walking each other home. Thank you.